Let's kick this off with the internal comms crisis. So, ecology member Ellen Griley is connected to this one. So, I just wanted to flag that up and share some pride there that Ellen's working on this. The Equilibrious Shifting Ground report surveyed 24 veteran internal comms practitioners, most of them with 5+ years in director level and above experience. What she found is that 88% said their personal well being was affected by overlapping crises, and 83% reported stress or burnout. What's notable is where they pin the blame. Workload is involved, but more importantly, it's the structural mismatch between what organizations say they want from comms, things like strategy, transparent, trust building, and what leadership actually allows. Nearly 3/4 claim to be aiming for a strategic comms model, but only 18% believe they've gotten there, and 61% have no formal change comms approach at all. In a moment where, as a report puts it, every communication is effectively a change communication, that's a pretty big gap. The report offers a framework called STEADY with 6 principles: safety, trust, environment, agency, dialogue, and you. The core argument is that neutral, sanitized language isn't safe communication. It just transfers risk from the organization's legal exposure onto employees' trust. Jenni, neutrality is named as the enemy here. The idea that the sanitized, perhaps even boring language is somehow still responsible communication. Do you buy this? And if you do, how do you make the case to a legal team or CEO who convinced that saying less is actually safer?
So I agree that if we're saying that that sort of neutral, boring language isn't safe, then I agree with that, because I think that is too risky, because when you're doing that, you're avoiding the real stuff. So all you're doing is just asking more questions. People are just going to have more questions. It doesn't really help anybody. I love the point about how it shifts the risk from the organization's legal exposure onto employees' trust. That for me is the big thing, because if you're trying to be safe, really what you're doing is not being safe. Like, I've been doing a lot of reading around psychological safety this week for some client stuff. And it basically says this, like, if you're trying to do all of this, then you're not having the candor, you're not doing the stuff that actually creates a psychologically safe organization, because you're kind of hiding away from that. So yes, I think that's the case. I think the challenge around how do you communicate that with legal teams and CEO who want to say less, it's all about the impact they want to have. That's always the conversation for me is, if you say this, this is what's going to happen. And if you're okay with that impact and consequence, then that's fine. Maybe I don't keep arguing, or maybe I do. But you've got to have that conversation about impact and consequence. Without that, I just think you're going to have a very tricky time trying to convince them.
Yeah. If I was a gambling man, and I am, this is the way I look at it. Anytime there's risky communication, you're gambling somewhere. And if you're playing it safe, you're then gambling with the employees and the trust, where if you come out strong, if you come out with, the real information, the risky stuff, then you're taking on that responsibility. So again, this just shows some of that weakness and neutrality of shifting that responsibility on to employees. No different than, I would say, how we view engagement. We put that on the shoulders. There's something wrong with them if they're not engaged, and not something wrong with the organization. So I think this is just another example of shifting that responsibility.
The bit that stands out for me in this report from Ellen is around what organizations say they want from communications and then what actually is allowed. And I've experienced this. I always joke that when I was hired as a communications director, they liked the idea of a communications director. They did not enjoy the reality of a communications director. And I think that's so often the truth. I think people have this vision of what that's going to be, but actually you're asking the hard question, you're challenging what that really means, you're getting them to think maybe a bit more ethically than they have before. And I think all of that is uncomfortable. And I think that gap is where I want to see people like the IOIC, who have talked this week about advocating for internal comms. Like, that's the job. That's the bit we need to be doing more of, to make sure that that's really happening, because that gap is where our biggest risk is, I think.
When you talked about the idea of a communicator, it reminded me of my wife, Kristen, talking about men as a concept sounds really good, but in practice, maybe not so much.
Oh, I adore her.
Enough of that. Enough of that. But if you want to check out this steady framework, we've got a link in the show notes. You can check out Ellen's work on that